Therapy isn't just for white people. Her debut memoir that we're discussing today chronicles Kiara's own journey to understanding racial trauma and the effect it has on Black mental health. Welcome, Kiara. I am so happy to be here with you today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here as well.
And normally I have a copy of the book that I hold up, but instead I annotated my copy digitally this time, but I loved it. Thank you. Yes, perfect. There it is. And we will have links in the chat later. I have them at the ready for us. So yeah, thank you so much. The book is so incredible. And, you know, to get us started, I sort of always like to start out with the inception stories. So I would love to hear about, you know, your journey to sort of writing this book. What made you want to write a memoir? What was the journey to the book? And why was it important to you to tell that larger story alongside, you know, your personal story?
Yeah, so I always knew that I was going to be a writer. I am a lawyer by training, to my UVA law hat on, which I didn't wash my hair today, so we love hats. But it was hard for me to sit down and to think through telling anybody else's story without starting with my own. I always imagined that I'd start with like a fantasy YA book. I love fantasy, have my Slytherin Harry Potter cup with me right now. But even just thinking through the fact that so many of the fantasy stories and sci-fi stories that I grew up loving and being obsessed with, they didn't have characters that looked like me. The very first book I ever wrote, I was 8 years old. I have a copy of it here somewhere. My dad found recently, and it's called Guilty, and I'm the main character in the book, and it's about a girl who's paranoid, someone who's trying to ruin her life, hashtag anxiety. Clearly I've been anxious forever, but my dad found the book, and it's like colored in crayon, but what's interesting is that I drew myself as white in the book. I didn't color my skin brown. And just having grown up loving books like The Secret Garden or Narnia and all of these other books that I was obsessed with, I just didn't have a concept for someone who looked like me in a book. So it just felt very natural before jumping into writing all of these other stories, where I really do hope to tell more fantasy sci-fi stories with Black characters, to just unpack what is that like growing up, never seeing yourself reflected in the spaces where you exist, whether that's literature or in the classroom or the presidential stage. Just what messages are being sent to you, and how has that affected you?
Definitely. And, you know, like that was something I really loved about the book, was that it was sort of a series of rewriting different narratives, right? We see these scenes that were shaping how you saw the world, how you saw yourself, these moments, these sort of social forces that were writing that story for you in your head. And then those moments of course correction that helped you really change that perspective. And what did you find? You know, I loved that part of the process for you was just talking to your family and getting their own stories, not even, you know, necessarily about their mental health, just about their lives, to try to understand where they came from. What did you find, you know, is often obscured or erased, not just in our families, but in our history, in our communities, that you think needs to become part of that like collective story that we're told?
I love the way that you phrased that, the collective story. And it's so often we think about history and we think about history books. We think about history on a very macro level, and we understand it's important. It's hard to know where you're going if you don't understand correctly where you came from. But we don't always take the time to do that for ourselves on a very personal level, actually having conversations with parents and grandparents about things that they've experienced, and their DNA a lot of times lives inside of us. And if you are, you know, lucky enough to even have family in your life who shares your DNA, I have a few friends who were adopted, and they tell me that for so long, a lot of what they were uncovering in therapy was, how do I move forward not knowing anything about my past? And so for the people who actually have that possibility to gather information from their parents and their grandparents, like, why not take advantage of that? And I couldn't really tell this story without looking back if you've ever been to the doctor and, you're with the new doctor and they start asking you questions, one of the first things they'll ask you is about your family history. If you sit down with a therapist, what I learned very quickly, because I was very arrogant going into therapy, which I talk about in the first chapter, I'm like, I've done well in school, I'm highly accomplished, like I'm not crazy, not like your other patients. So I just need to like work on this anxiety thing. I don't need to talk about my past. There's nothing to unpack, which obviously I was very wrong. But just realizing even in therapy, one of the first questions I start to ask is, tell me about your family history. What was that like for you growing up? What were your parents like? What were your grandparents like? And I strongly believe there's this quote by Esther Perel that says, tell me how you were raised and I'll tell you how you love. And so much of that has resonated with me, because just going back and uncovering a lot of where I came from and how I see the world really helped me in the present moment say, oh, that's why you're insecure in this way, or that's why you feel like you need control in your relationships, where these things where you're like, why do I do this? I used to do that to myself all the time. I know that this is wrong, but why am I doing it? I think therapy really helped me uncover that by looking backwards.
I love that. And, that makes me think too about like sort of why this larger conversation happens, I think matters. I think like the title of your book says so much, this idea that you felt that therapy wasn't for you, not even as an individual, but just like therapy is for white people. It's, it's not something that's for me. It's not something that's for people like me. And, right now we're hearing so much about self-care, about mental health. It feels like these conversations are now happening everywhere, especially because, we had this crash course in why those things mattered when the pandemic hit, and especially, but what do you feel needs to change about that dialogue, that story that we're telling about mental wellness, in order to make sure that, that people of color, that women, that poor folks, that folks who really need to heal from intergenerational trauma and systemic trauma are centered and included? What was it about the conversation that made you feel like it wasn't for you?
So I think it's twofold. I think in the Black community and a lot of communities of color, there's a heavy reliance on faith. There's this idea that you are too blessed to be stressed. And in a lot of ways, the church has played a huge role in just Black civil rights. And in some ways, that's been fantastic. Obviously, we know Martin Luther King was a reverend. In other ways, I think an over-reliance on faith sometimes feels like spiritual bypassing, which I've heard people use that term, where it's like, yeah, you've prayed and God is good, but also you can be anxious and depressed or confused and have trauma. And that does not mean that you're not praying enough or not spiritual enough. So I think that narrative exists a lot in the Black community. And then on the other side, a lot of the women I would say I turn to when I'm just, needing some inspiration, everyone from like the Esther Perels or the Brene Browns, they're all white. I have never seen someone at that level who looks like me. And I think it's very easy then to just tell yourself this idea that, okay, maybe this isn't for people like me. And then when you combine that with, the hashtag Black Girl Magic movement, which is amazing. I love it. Yes, Black women are amazing, but I'm human. Like, I'm not a superhero. I need rest. And sometimes I cry. And I think just putting pressure on yourself to show up as this strong Black woman who's made it through the world and been able to overcome is great. But you can put that pressure on yourself and start to think, oh, okay, so I'm not allowed to cry. Like, I'm the strong friend. I'm the strong one. I can't let people see me break down. I can't be weak. So all of that just kind of jumbled together. I have so many people in my own family who don't understand therapy. I had an aunt who, told my mom, well, there's clearly something wrong with your daughter because she goes to therapy. And just trying to really change the narrative about what it means to go to therapy and to take care of your mental health.
Definitely. And I mean, you close your book with this incredible, letter to your younger self, sort of unpacking and writing out, some of these things that you've learned, and giving yourself that grace. And I'm curious, what were some of the biggest lessons you learned or realizations that came from therapy and from digging into your family's history and from really like confronting, the ugly history of white supremacy that has shaped so many of our lives.
I really feel like talking about it and sharing our stories is incredibly important. Stories have a way of humanizing people that labels do not. I think we live in this world where we like to get people's labels. When I say labels, like, okay, what color are you? What's your gender? What's your religion? What's your political affiliation? Once I have all these labels, I can then decide who you are and how valuable you are and whether or not we're going to get along. We make all of these assumptions about people when in reality, it's the stories that humanize us and connect us. And I just think it's important to be students of untold Black stories as it pertains to racism, but just in general, untold stories. Not all of us are going to have movies written about our lives, and not everyone's going to have a book, but we all have a story to share. And so even I found in conversations where I'm sharing stories, I have a lot of, deep things I talk about there in that book. I talk about my sister's eating disorder. I talk about my own struggle with faith and white Jesus, and does God love me? I'm Black. I don't look like him. Like, what does that mean? And just a lot of really vulnerable stories. But what I found is that it allows other people to open up and share their stories. And there's a special connection that happens in that moment. I think one of my favorite quotes I once heard was, the most powerful words in the world besides I love you are me too. And we can't really get to that moment where we're collectively sharing and having connection if we don't first have the courage to share our stories.
I love that. And I mean, there were so many, it's funny that you say that, because I had those moments when I was reading the book, particularly when you were unpacking, like money and class and these sort of, people making remarks about like the comfort food that, you loved, and the way that it felt for you to feel like it was a commentary on where you came from and who you are and who your family is. And, sort of that feeling of being like, oh my God, okay, this person has way more money than me. Their family has way more money than me. And, I've something that I've written a lot about too is like class mobility. And, it's weird to sort of be in a different place than where you came from, but want to honor where you came from as well. And I'm curious, what were some of the ways in which therapy, provided you some healing into your relationship with money and especially work? I loved reading about your transformation, your decision to leave the corporate world because of your mental health, for the sake of yourself. And so I'm curious, like, what do your relationships to work and money look like now because of, the therapy that you've had the opportunity to unpack all of this?
I am still working through a lot of that. I think one of the most beautiful things about therapy, and I tell people all the time, I didn't start going to therapy and then feel like, oh my gosh, I'm healed. I have generalized anxiety. I still get very anxious. I'm also on medication, #Lexapro, but therapy has been amazing with that. But I think one of the best pieces of going to therapy is that I now have tools so that when I'm in an uncomfortable situation, I have like very specific things that I do to like get myself back on track. And I tell people too that I write from the perspective not of the doctor, but the patient. Like, I'm actually a person experiencing strong emotions and going through these awkward moments. I think there are a lot of places in my book where if I could go back now, I'd have so much to say to the other character. But in the moment, I just kind of tend to freeze up and not say anything at all because there's just so much happening in my head. But with therapy specifically, a lot of times when I have these moments, I can acknowledge the feeling. I remind myself that I am not that feeling. So you might be feeling sad, but it doesn't mean you're a sad person. You might be feeling less than, but it doesn't mean you are less than. It doesn't mean you're not worthy. So I have this conversation in my head, and I picture this train, myself getting on the train of letting the emotions carry me down whatever rabbit hole I would end down. And I visualize myself getting off the train and allowing the emotion to pass. So it's not necessarily that I feel like I'm healed as I just think about class and some of the awkward conversations that I have with people. Or I had a conversation recently with a friend because my parents are both professionals, a doctor and a lawyer. And when you hear that in America, you generally think, oh, that family is really well off. But yeah. My dad has just finished paying off his student loans this year. When my grandma, who passed from COVID last year, when my grandma passed, there wasn't any money to pass down that my parents inherited. There was no property. My parents paid $50,000 for medical bills and a lot of bills that she hadn't paid. So I think even death in Black family, a lot of times it's not this exciting thing where you get a will and you figure out, you know, what's being given to you. It's like, okay, now we've got to find and collect the money for the funeral and the unpaid bills, and just how generational wealth, it actually makes a difference. And it takes a long time to build generational wealth. It doesn't happen in a generation. So I'm constantly having to have conversations with myself, reminding myself, you're still worthy, you're not your feelings, because it can be awkward.
Yeah, I love that too, because I feel like, you know, it's like those are the moments too where like injustice becomes so tangible and we feel that like anger and we feel upset about like the unfairness of inequity in, you know, of difference and all of these ways that so many of us are routinely, you know, that discrimination is so embedded in like the fiber of this country and the way that our lives are shaped by it. And, you know, something that was powerful about the book is that you sort of juxtapose these stories of these larger scale, almost like global stories that are traumatic, right? George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, like these really hard to confront, but important to talk about moments where injustice becomes stark and clear. And yet there's still these divisive conversations, these, in your case, like people asking you awkward questions, or, you know, people you haven't heard from in years, like sending you money on Venmo. And I just thought it was, you know, because while we're dealing with this personal stuff in our own lives, a lot of times we're also dealing with a catastrophe or a headline that reminds us and makes us feel those feelings and compounds those feelings. And I'm curious, you know, obviously we're in a moment right now where there's no shortage of traumatic headlines and things happening, and just being pinged constantly by these reminders that like the Supreme Court doesn't think you're fully human, or this lawmaker doesn't think you're fully human, or whatever it is. And so how have you learned to sort of stay afloat in those kinds of challenging moments when it's so out of your control, when it's something that, you know, is happening to someone, but it's impacting you deeply and it has ramifications for you, and, you know, in those really challenging moments?
It's such a great question. And I think it's also counterintuitive for a lot of people. The big macro traumas, right? And I define trauma like Dr. Nita Phillips. She says that trauma is anything that negatively affects the way you see yourself, God, and the world around you. So when you think about it like that, we're all experiencing trauma all the time. And the big macro traumas, the George Floyd situations, they're actually a lot easier for me to cope with, because number one, I'm not doing it alone. It's like we're all dealing with that together. We're all talking about it. It's in the headlines. Number two, you have no choice but to deal with it, to continue to live and to move on. Like you still have to show up to work. You still have to, you're forced to kind of move through it. It's actually a lot of times the smaller microaggressions and the micro traumas that live with me more, because those are the things where I can kind of sweep under the rug and then they start to collect. And also you're dealing with it alone. It's not like I can go to anybody on the street and be like, man, that George Floyd trial was stressful. And they can be like, yeah, true. But if it's an interpersonal connection I had, then it goes back to the quote, the most powerful words in the world besides I love you or me too. A lot of times, unless you're finding someone who went through the exact same experience, you don't get that like collective me too, we can talk about it, I see you, you see me thing. So for example, I have in the book, you know, when I had an IUD at one point and wanting to get that removed. And one of the first thing the doctor said was, well, do you think you're going to be able to keep your legs closed? And I was like, what kind of question is that? And I in that chapter, I talked about just healthcare in general, things that doctors have said to me, like, you are you sure you have good enough insurance to cover this? And I try to explain, like, yeah, I have really good insurance. And they go look at my file. They're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize you were a lawyer. Otherwise, I would have treated you like a human. Had another doctor who looked at my chart and then came back and was like, when I first met him, he was very cold and dismissive. And he looked at my chart, saw that I was a lawyer, and came back, was like, well, now I guess I have to keep you alive, huh? So like you said it as a joke, but to me, I'm thinking, so
Right.
does that mean you wouldn't have kept me alive if you didn't believe that, because like now you see me as worthy? Just so many of those little moments that I think have been a lot harder for me to work through, because they were quick and they happen and you don't know how to respond. And you're like, okay, I'll just process that later. And you just sweep it under the rug. But then when that happens to you over and over and over and over again, it can really start to affect not just your mental health, but your physical health.
Definitely. And I mean, I'm like, I just want to take a second to to quote Dory Howard from the chat, that pardon her French, but fuck that. Like all of those moments in the book, I was like open, like gasping and clutching my pearls, because I'm just like, what? Like it's also, it's also like you're saying, like in those interpersonal moments with a microaggression, it's almost that the thing that's so hard about it is that it's personal, but it's also often it's isolated, right? There aren't people in their car listening to the same news story feeling the same way as you. You're sort of like coping with that alone. And so yeah, just want to let you know we're sending you solidarity whenever you have one of these moments moving forward. And
I'm never prepared, and like and it still continues to happen all the time. I had somebody just the other day say, you talk like a white girl. Like, I'm so surprised that you're so articulate. And just the fact that you would connect being articulate with the skin color is ridiculous. And there are moments when they pass so quickly. Then there are moments I also talk about in my book where I had a law professor who in front of my class used to always tell me, you're so smart for a colored girl. And he'd use the word colored. And just every time I have those situations, like it's almost like a PTSD, like my mind goes back to like
right.
every single moment it's happened. So again, going to therapy, I think, has really given me the tools that I need to process it, but also just recognizing the importance of talking about it.
Definitely. And I mean, that sort of is a perfect lead in for this last question, which is, you wrote in the acknowledgements that this book really helped you connect with your inner child. And, like you said, so many of the scenes in the book are you sort of looking back and being like, I did not know what to say when this totally bonkers thing was said to me. This like beyond the pale offensive thing was said in front of me. Like, and I think we all have those moments, right? And yet you took on this obviously emotional challenge of like writing down these stories and committing these moments to paper. And so, we're big fans of writing it all out here at Jane. We have like a journaling session every week and stuff. And I'm curious, when we talk about honoring all the feelings, like putting these stories and these lessons down on paper and now having those things be in front of people's eyes and, in bookstores and stuff, how has that journey with the book felt for you? And, how has it been sort of moving through the process of writing it and then also like having to talk about it even more and having to share it with others and receive their feedback about it?
I think it's hit or miss. It just depends on the day. Sometimes I have conversations and they turn into just such healing moments, and I feel like there's so much compassion, and I'm like, I'm so glad I wrote this book. This is why I did it. And then I have other moments, and I've had some like trolls on Instagram who will like make fake pages and just sending me really nasty messages. Some of them I'm just like, you have nothing better to do with your time. Like things like, just because you're educated doesn't mean you're better than like blacks. Like you're still black at the end of the day. Like what? Like just people. And I know that I was kind of ready for that when I wrote the book. I know like the title is just because I used the word like white people. I think sometimes there's like a hyper personalization where it's like, this book feels like an attack on me. And I'm like, it has literally, I don't say, it's not about you. Like you're making it about you and it's not about you. So just kind of like reminding myself too, everybody has an opinion. Not everybody is going to like what you wrote, respect what you wrote, understand what you wrote. And most of these people haven't even taken the time to like read the book, or they don't know me. They'll just like see a clip somewhere and feel like they're doing their duty to make sure I feel not great about myself. But I've really just had to remind myself that like we're all human. And I do tell myself this story. So much of the way that we show up, as I've learned in therapy, is a result of our trauma, our past experiences, the way that we were treated. And I think at our purest, most human beings can be love. So I've kind of started to just see that as I feel sorry for this person, because in whatever space you were raised, you were not taught to love others as you love yourself and to love unconditionally. So trying to just like change it into compassion. So yeah.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so, so, so much, Kiara, for writing the book, for being here to talk with us about the book. And yeah, for everything. Thank you. It was so wonderful. And I'm dropping a link in the chat for everyone to buy a copy immediately. Also, sorry that Eli keeps barking down here. And yeah, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you, everyone who's tuning in. And yeah, we'll be plugging this book everywhere. I'm like, it was so powerful.
Awesome. Thank you all for having me. And I see your comments, for just like being supportive. I really appreciate it.
Yay. Thank you so much, Kiara.